So I got to tell you, I am still salty about something that happened in Texas over 100 years ago. And it has nothing to do with the Alamo. I don't know if you all know this, but back in the 1800s, there were Unitarians and Universalists in Texas. That surprises a lot of people because a lot of times, right, we think of Unitarian Universalism as being this, very Boston-centric sort of thing. But we were here too, and even before we actually had Unitarian or Universalist congregations, we were influencing this state. For instance, does anyone here know that Stephen F. Austin, you know about his connection? Some of them have seen some nods. So he had a cousin, Mary Austin Holly, and she was the wife and then widow of a Unitarian minister. And the two of them were extremely close. You can go down to the Texas archives and see letters that they wrote back and forth to each other. I know that there is one letter that Mary wrote to him, pleading with him to maintain an anti-slavery attitude. We have not always won our battles, but we have been influential. And yet, we still do influence this state, and she still influenced her cousin. In 1836, he wrote a letter to her, and you tell me you can't hear the Unitarian influence in this. He was writing about his vision for what Texas could be. He said, "We are trying to banish from our homes religious intolerance and despotism, and to establish in the place of it liberty and freedom of conscience." How many thousands of people, of families of all denominations might find a home in Texas if religious toleration were once firmly rooted there? Religion, morality, the arts and sciences, the great sources of liberty, which is in fact the cause of all mankind, all unite in calling upon the free, the generous, the enterprising, and the pious to step forward in aid of Texas. We expect that the pulpit will send its eloquent voice to the people in the cause of all free churches, the cause of truth and justice. Tell me that doesn't sound Unitarian, right? We were here in the 1800s, and it looks like in 1854, it looks like the first Universalist minister came and set up a church. His name was Marmaduke Gardner, and it was just, isn't that a great name? Marmaduke Gardner. He had 19 kids. Let us all give a prayer for his wife, Rhoda Ussery. Bad, but we bore all of those kids. But he moved here, just north of here in Williamson County, and he set up a church there. This was in 1855. And he was on fire for that Universalist gospel. In a land that you can look at reports from the Universalist register at that time. And they'll talk about what Brother Gardner, Brother Marmaduke was doing. And they said that he was out here valiantly trying to spread the Universalist message in an area that was inhospitable to Universalism. It still kind of feels that way some days, doesn't it? So he began putting up these congregations. His main congregation was there in Williamson County. By 1872, he also had one that he was going to frequently in Milam County. And then just going all around the central Texas and East Texas area, gathering people together and getting them to set up congregations. Now, his wife said that he was the most headstrong man she had ever seen, which was probably very helpful. I don't know about you, but I find it still really helpful helpful to be headstrong if you're going to survive in Texas. And he frequently would challenge conservative preachers to debates. Those fire and brimstone preachers who really believed in eternal damnation. And apparently he would just go and go and go with them. There's one story about how he was debating this other clergy person, and there was a third person there watching the time on their debate. And Marmaduke just kept going. And finally, when he had exhausted all of his arguments, he looked to the timekeeper and he said, "How much time do I have left?" And the timekeeper said, "I don't know, my watch stopped." To which Marmaduke said, "I knew I was making a powerful argument, but I did not know that it would stop time." They also say he was so powerful in converting people that whenever he would go, setting up these other congregations, if he needed a preacher who would be, affiliated with that one, that he'd just convert them. He'd just go and convert them. And he also was bringing, for all of this, and I get the feeling from what I have read that he was a very imposing figure. They say he was a very big man, his grandkids had to help him off with his shoes. He was so tall and big. Obviously, a very strong debater, but it was love that pushed him. It was love that was underneath all of that. Love combined with justice. And I think that we here in Texas, even today, have a special understanding for how important it is, the tension between the two, and that we have both of those. There's this story where he was going off to preach at one of these congregations he had set up. He had a niece with him, and this was all on horseback then, so they were going to go to this town and spend the night, and he'd preach, and then they'd come back. And so on their way there, they passed this beautiful peach tree, all in bloom. And his niece recalled later him talking about what a miracle that was. Something like that it would come from nature. And then the next day, when they were going home, they passed that tree again. And it had been just completely ruined by an animal in the run. And he turned to her and he said, "There is a lesson. If we allow evil to overcome us, we can ruin the beauty of your life in one night." So these are the kinds of things that he was spreading. Here this is right after the Civil War and in Texas. And for all of that, and Jewish too, when he was 66, this was in 1878, he sent in his report to the Universalist Register, letting them know about what was happening with all of these different congregations. He apparently was having a hard time functioning. He was he had rheumatism so bad. And he wrote to them and he said, "Should my ministry come to an end, I see no one that can fill my place." And there wasn't anyone, because they were doing this missionary work, but they weren't institutional. They didn't have the know-how, they didn't have the resources. And so when he died, pretty much all of those other congregations died too. Now, right around that time was when the Billingses came to Texas. Some of you may have heard about them before. If you've ever had Kaya Hartwood, get her in any conversation. She loves the story of Mary Billings, so you'll hear all about it. But they were Universalists too. And James Billings came here in about 1880. And he had a missionary heart. His wife, or she wasn't his wife yet, Mary Billings, moved here, married him about 5 years later, and they just set to work, and they absolutely changed Texas. They were planting so many Universalist congregations. They were getting out there. They were doing a preaching circuit of their own. In addition to that, they started a church, All Souls in Hyco, he was trying to match up clergy. There were more Universalists that were moving here. He was trying to match them up with their churches. They were doing revivals. They were going to church meetings. They were preaching. James Billings was invited, I believe, by Phil and Shin, no less, who was famous also for planting churches, to come out to California, but he refused. He wanted to stay in Texas. There's this quote, not by a Universalist, but by another missionary, C.T. Studd, who says, "Some want to live within the sound of the chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of love." And I think that kind of sums up how the Billings felt. And right now, that's how I feel. Is there anyone else that feels like this? I don't know about you, but I am getting so many messages from people in other states, people in blue states saying, "Well, you just need to move out of Texas." No. There's an old joke. I imagine most of you have heard this. I think it's probably the most well-known you joke, the one about the person who dies, and he comes, after he dies, he's walking down this road, and he comes upon this sign. It has 3 different arrows. One arrow says heaven, points one direction. One arrow says hell, points another direction. And one says discussion. And as the joke goes, being a Unitarian Universalist, he goes for the discussion. It's an old joke. I kind of chuckle at it, but I vehemently disagree with it. Because I think for those of us who are Unitarian Universalists, living in places like Texas and like Florida, we're going to choose the sign to help, to go help get people out. Because we know that there are people who are living in hell right now, not some otherworldly hell, right now. And it is often right now our legislators who are decking out hell for them. In my congregation at Live Oak, I already know of at least 3 or 4 families that I am losing this year because they have to move out of Texas because their children are not safe here. We still have that missionary spirit, and it's a part of us. So back to the Billingses. They planted a lot of congregations. There were Universalist churches in Bowie, Lone Star, Richland, Hilton, Little Briar, Henderson, Roby, Fair Oaks, McDade, Beaumont, Comanche, Jacksonville, Jefferson, Mount Elm, Sylvester, Blue, Barron View, Pontus, Somerset, Garrison, Corpus Christi, and Houston. They were gifted at setting up churches and getting people fired up. The Universalists at that time, they were organized around what were called state conventions. And so once they started getting these congregations set up, then the Billingses set up a state convention where all these Universalists could come together. Kind of like when we come together at GA. Anyone going to GA next week? Okay, awesome. I won't be there. Give me a report afterwards. We should feel so proud because these Universalists at that time were doing their best to influence the development of this state. They started right away with their Universalist convention, passing resolutions, because that's what we Unitarian Universalists do. Again, this is in the late 1800s. First thing was passing a resolution about temperance, which I realize for some people might seem a little strange, but I imagine many of you know temperance was a feminist issue because women couldn't just leave their spouse and their family, and so a whole family could be dealing with abuse and financial ruin because of alcohol. They passed a resolution against capital punishment, especially hangings, which they found barbaric. Again, this was in Texas. They passed a resolution about kindness to animals, which just completely tickles me. Again, in Texas, but this was part of the Universalist ethos. They passed resolutions in support support for interfaith relationships, anti-war, and get this, in 1890, they passed a resolution calling for women to receive equal pay with men for equal services rendered. In 1890. I imagine you know about one of the big Unitarians who was coming in. Because this, at the end of the 1800s, that's where the Unitarians started making their way over to Texas. And one was the Reverend Edwin Miller Wheelock, who started the Unitarian Society in Austin. He died in 1901. Mary Billings, her husband James had already died. She died in 1904. And Unitarianism and Universalism virtually disappeared. In Austin, there really was no more Unitarian. There were little pockets of people who knew each other, but there really was no significant Unitarian presence until about 1951. And the Universalists, this is the one that just so breaks my heart because the Billingses did so much work, and yet whenever you read the history of what happened next, the word you see over and over again is decline. They declined, they faded away, because for all of their passion, they were not in the business of institution building. Now, there was one with Wheelock. He didn't leave behind an institution, but he left behind a dog. Does everyone know about this story? I see. In case there's anyone who doesn't know about this story. His daughter was Emily Wheelock Howson. She died in 1957, and she made a legacy gift to First Unitarian. That's why y'all are here, right? That's why y'all have this hall, this property, was because she made a legacy gift. I said that I'm salty, and I really am, because I'm a seventh generation Texan, as Chris mentioned, and I just think about how different Texas could have been, that we could be in a completely different position now if there had been people with the know-how and the resources to worry not just about the church that they were going to go to, but the church that their grandkids would go to. And this hits me really personally, because I was mentioning to the table over here, where I was getting to hear everyone's stories about how they came to UUism. I'm a second generation. My parents found this religion in a fluke. And my mom is 92. She's still alive and tells me stories. And she had a beloved grandmother, Granny Sapp, Linda Desire Clopton Sapp, who my mom says now, she was a Universalist. She didn't have the words for it. And so then she never had a community for it. And her life would have been so much better if there had been a Universalist or a Unitarian church that she could have gone to. She was born in 1878 in McDade. In an interesting twist of history, Marmaduke Gardner died in McDade in 1879. Just missed each other. And what he had built didn't last. And so she never had that church to go to. I mentioned that it was kind of a fluke that my parents found Unitarian Universalism, or Unitarianism is where they started. My dad, who grew up a Baptist, Southern Baptist in East Texas, he was pipelining. This was in the early 50s. He was pipelining out in the Panhandle, and he happened to hear on the radio a Unitarian preacher in Washington, D.C. named A. Powell Davies. A. Powell Davies believed in building institutions, and in fact, if you go up to the D.C. area, you're probably not going to find a congregation that he was not connected to in some way. But he would get on the radio, and talk about this religion of Unitarianism. He was often challenging Billy Graham to debates. I don't know that Billy ever took him up on it. And so my dad said, well, that's really interesting, because he had gone off to A&M and started questioning everything that he had been taught. Then he went back to Center, Texas, in Shelby County, and started trying to talk about it with some of his friends, and they said, Tommy Fontaine is an atheist. Let's kick his ass. Here was someone extending a lifeline. Of course, back then, there wasn't anything in the panhandle. But years later, he and my mom and my older sister, Rebecca, moved to New Orleans. And when Rebecca was coming home from elementary school and asking, well, when was she going to do confirmation class? Because this was New Orleans. My dad remembered that thing he had heard on the radio, and he picked up the phone, and there was a Unitarian church in New Orleans. And so that's how, many years before I was born, I became a Unitarian Universalist. When we were telling our stories over here about how we came to this faith, it was a fluke, right? For all of us. Harmony Gardner, here's cheering. We happened to read the right thing, or talk to the right person, or happen to hear someone in the panhandle of Texas on the radio. We need Unitarian Universalism, not just now, but in the future. I have no idea what the future is going to look like. As Chris said, I've been at Live Oak for 9 years. If you told me 9 years ago, 9 years from now, your congregation will have gone through a global pandemic where you literally can't breathe the same air as each other, and an attempted insurrection of Congress, as well as a bunch of other things that have happened, I would not have believed it. So I can't tell you what is going to happen in the future. Is it going to be a dystopia? Are there going to be any utopian elements? I don't know, but what I do know is that that future needs us. So when Emily Wheelock died, that was 1957. So by my math, that's 66 years. So 66 years from now, it'll be 2089. What do you want to be existing in Texas in 2089? We can't do anything about the past, and it's probably ridiculous for me to still be salty about it, but we can do something about the future. I can't do anything to help my great-grandmother, but I want to make darn sure that my great-granddaughter, I can't do anything for my great-grandmother, I want to make sure that my great-granddaughter has a Unitarian Universalist congregation that she can be a part of, and that we can please change Texas to what it should have been. I hope you think about this. I hope you talk about this with your friends. And I hope you think about, okay, we sit in chairs that we did not buy. We are in a hall, right, that someone else paid for. How are we going to pay it forward?